Hey everyone, it's OSK, and welcome back to the channel. In this episode of Spellbreak Academy, we're going to be talking about in-game awareness again, this time tying up the previous two parts in this series and concluding with some final thoughts on how to navigate through a typical game of Spellbreak. I think that this will be practical in most cases so you can see the results of mastering in-game awareness. Now without further ado, let's get into this. So, for tying it all together, I'm going to be briefly going over the previous two videos just as a quick reminder before we go for the deep dive. The first section we talked about were tools in the game. These are things that you have at your disposal on your character to affect the game world and other players. These include your class, talents, gauntlets, rune, and gear. Your tools also allow you to reposition, deal damage, and sustain yourself in a fight. It's also important to know your opponent will largely have the same tools at their disposal as you do, so keep that in mind. The second section we covered was terrain. Terrain covers all the obstacles and landmarks you can find in the Hollowlands, and within this section we discuss sources of cover, structure knowledge, and location of resources. Mastering terrain in Spellbreak and keeping it in the back of your mind at all times is key to mastering the art of resetting and efficient travel, and this will help you survive more fights in the long run. The last section we covered was zone knowledge, and this exemplified a few points, namely mastering the first zone timing, rotating to the third zone, and keeping damage values in mind, as well as general zone timing towards the end game. If you can zone your opponent and cut them off routinely, you will have an easier time in the Hollowlands. Now for tying this all together. I will mostly go over strategies you can implement in the game to immediately see improvement while also providing broader points you can experiment with yourself, while always keeping your in-game awareness as your highest priority. Let's break down a typical fight in Spellbreak, for example. You're running Pyromancer with a Toxic Offhand, Dash Rune, and the classic 2-2-2 Runic Fluency, Fervor, Recovery talent setup against a Conduit with Fire Offhand in the third rotation of the game. You are in the northern part of Gritfeld where there are a lot of cliffs but not much else. Conduits are very strong in the open areas of the map where there is very little cover, so you need to be able to somehow break line of sight and approach your enemy. You are running a Dragonfire build with no long-range options, so you are at a heavy disadvantage from the start. Most players would think to charge in head first with your Dash Rune and Firefly, but in the process you will likely eat a lot of damage that you can't really make up very quickly. The optimal way to play this would be to play along the backside of the cliffs behind you and see if you can loop around towards the Conduit, and maybe you even kite towards the south of Gritfeld where you know there is more cover and more opportunities for a combust to proc off of walls and ceilings of the buildings there. There's also plenty of opportunity to gain high ground and rain spells from above. The further away from a Conduit you are, the more bloom from the lightning gauntlet becomes a problem, so don't be afraid to run if the terrain is not favorable. Once you're in the more densely packed area of Gritfeld, if the Conduit approaches, you have many more options to use Dash and Firefly to close the distance, as well as dip back to reset if you need to. You can also check the method of a Conduit's approach. If they're running Teleport, you know that a legendary variant of the rune has a 13-second cooldown, so you are free to attack and dodge spells using your Dash Rune liberally. While you're doing all of this, you need to make sure you're keeping track of when the next zone is going to close and where. If you see it's closing further south, maybe you position yourself where you're safe from the Conduit's lightning, but also between them and the next zone. Once he's forced to close the distance, you can open the fight with a Dragonfire explosion and burst them down to win the fight. This was just an example, but you can see how keeping track of cooldowns, knowing how to use the terrain with your map knowledge, and realizing that they're forced to close the distance all factor into how you can create advantages for yourself and come out on top in all of your fights. Speaking of creating advantages for yourself, let's apply that to something I didn't mention at all during that fight: third-party potential. This is always a hot-button issue in the Spellbreak community. How do you deal with third parties in the middle of an intense fight? This can be very tricky, and it relies on good in-game awareness and reading your opponents. Avoiding and peeling third parties requires mastery of in-game awareness and movement mechanics, so it can be quite difficult to escape in most scenarios, and sometimes it will legitimately be impossible to escape a third party. Let's go over the things you can control so at least you have some tools to work with. My first tip to you would be to always play on the outside part of the fight. What this means is positioning yourself in such a way to always be the furthest person away from the middle of the engagement. What this does is create relative proximity between your two opponents and makes it more attractive for them subconsciously to attack each other rather than you. The brain is programmed to tend to follow the path of least resistance and spend the least amount of energy it can to achieve a goal. It's basic biology. What you do when you create space is tell your opponent that it's easier to attack the other guy right now than it is to attack you. This is especially important to catch early on in a third party, as you can often escape with more available health and then return to an easier fight once they get themselves low. Once you're on the outside of the fight, you're free to keep your distance and poke down your opponents. This is especially obnoxious if you have a gauntlet designed for long range like a frost or lightning. While you're poking your enemies from a distance, I would recommend keeping them at a similar amount of health if you can. This way you don't risk going to finish an exile and then having an enemy with more health than you to fight against. You don't have to do this, I guess, but it's an effective habit that I've found always helps me out quite a bit. While we're on the topic of third partying, you need to make sure you practice what I call keeping your ears open. What this means is to constantly be listening for spell and sorcery sounds as well as rune activations. An easy one to keep track of would be the charge of an ice lance. It is programmed to have a very noticeable audio cue during the draw animation, so be sure to be on alert if you hear it. Another one would be the crash of a boulder fall sorcery. This one in particular is very loud and can be heard from quite a distance away. It also doesn't have any utility uses, so if you hear one, you can be sure it means a fight is nearby. It might be worth it for you to hop in the practice tool and familiarize yourself with all the different sounds in the game to really help yourself be more aware in the game from an audio perspective. Yet another thing you want to make sure to do in case of third partying is to avoid using rune charges too much, as if a third party comes in and you're just caught out in the open by an opponent you didn't see, you'll be a sitting duck if you don't have a movement option available. You won't have this problem if you're a Tempest, but if you're a Conduit, you may want to keep an extra rune charge available at all times by preempting your overload skill. Or if you're a Pyromancer, you may want to always have your firewall off cooldown just in case you need it to escape. One last thing you'll want to do while looting and traveling through the mid-game is to make sure you're always moving. You may have heard of the PUBG or Fortnite wiggle where you constantly are moving around even just a little bit to avoid getting picked by a sniper. The same applies to Spellbreak. I even mentioned something like this in part 2 where you can easily snipe someone when they try to read a talent scroll. You always want to be on the move to throw off the aim of someone who may be trying to ruin your fun. Follow these tips and hopefully you'll be able to deal with most surprises and third parties. Following into some general strategies you can follow, let's get into the early game. There are a few things you can do to make your life a little easier. The first thing you should be doing immediately off drop and before you even touch the ground is rotate your camera and see if any enemies are dropping near you. If they are, you can follow that part 2 strategy of landing on an upper wall or railing to begin raining down spells from above. This is really effective for Pyromancer and Toxicologist specifically, and is one of the reasons they're both strong in general. Building off of this, we discussed knowing when you're strong and when your opponent is weak. If you do happen to be running Stone Shaper, Pyromancer, or Toxicologist, it's a good idea to recognize your relative strength in the early game in terms of damage. Usually, unless they find really good loot really fast, Frostborns, Conduits, and Tempests are all cheesable in the early game as they all rely on other pieces of loot to be effective. Especially if you find semi-decent loot like an uncommon belt, some boots, maybe a decent rune, it's a good idea to pressure these types of players. Of course, don't get carried away and take fights you're obviously disadvantaged in, but you get the picture. Try pressuring enemies early on in the game to find your relative limits. Following with this concept, it is very important in the early game that you stay on the outside part of the loot area like I mentioned in the third party section. The last thing you need is a suboptimal final build going against 2 or more people without a belt. Truly a nightmare scenario that you will lose 9 times out of 10 if they're any good. Alright, so those are some early game strategies to keep in mind. The mid game we've pretty much already covered between the previous 2 parts, so now let's talk about some late game strategies. First and foremost, let's talk about a top 5 situation in a relatively small circle. The last thing you want to do is being caught between 2 players doing something like reading a scroll or sorting through loot. If you enter a final circle scenario, or even just a small enough circle where the enemy can easily get to you, do not loot. Whatever talent scrolls you have, you're probably not going to have time to read anymore. Whatever better gear you find, you probably don't want to reset the timer on your sorceries by picking up a legendary fire compared to an epic one. The difference between the two is very small, and adding an extra 15 seconds before you can use Firefly is not ideal. Bottom line, do not go into a late game scenario trying to loot unless it's just to pick up some quick potions. Some more strategies you should follow is to play the zone and look for superior positioning. Any higher platform or ledge you can position yourself on is going to be massively beneficial. Also, as we mentioned in the zone knowledge section of part 2, if you can zone off your opponents from the next zone, they'll be forced to approach and be under additional pressure, forcing misplays. This will allow you to force movement from your opponents in a way that helps you preempt your next attack. For example, if you lay down a firewall in a certain area, generally your opponent will want to avoid the damage and will run in a different direction. You can use this to place a firewall to the right while lining up a few spells on the left. They may also be forced to levitate, which gives you instant mana pressure and also gives you an easier time lining up a frost shot for some free damage. If they burn a rune to reposition, that's even better. Speaking of runes, you may have found that some players like to cheese the final zone by using Featherfall or Flight to get a massive height advantage to allow crucial sorceries to recharge and rain spells from above. The obvious counter to this strategy would be to carry a frost or a lightning gauntlet with you to cover this weakness. I always make sure to have one of these two on me at all times for this scenario, and easy long-range engagements. With all these strategies in mind, you should have an easier time in all scenarios, but especially in the late game circles. And that, my friends, is going to complete the Spellbreak Academy in-game awareness series. Hope you all enjoyed this 3-parter and eagerly await the next installment of Spellbreak Academy, where we will likely talk about nothing but combat. We'll get to it when we get to it, but guys, thank you all so much for watching. If you liked it, you know what to do. Subscribe as well, do the YouTube thing, follow all those socials, the Discord and the Twitter, and follow the Twitch down in the box. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all out there.